All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Jim Schoaf. I'm a senior fellow here, and I run the Japan program. This is one of my favorite times of year. We get to run our Japan This Year program, Japan in 2020. This is the 7th time we've been co-hosting, organizing together with the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C., and we have a new decade. It's our first time hosting Japan this year in the Reiwa era, and we have relatively new leadership at the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. as well. It's our first time collaborating with the new president, Ryan Schaefer. Of course, Jim Zumwalt has taken the reins as chairman of the board there. So it's a lot of new pages being turned today, and it's truly our pleasure. We started a little bit late this morning, sorry, but our Assistant Secretary Stilwell is on his way. He should be arriving relatively shortly. But before we begin our opening keynote speech, I just wanted to say a few words about this program and this partnership, and then I'll turn it over to Ryan to talk about the society and its activities this year. I mean, I say this every year, but this is something I look forward to because the partnership with the Japan America Society really allows us to re-engage with them and to collaborate with them and their whole network of people here in town. And we get to bring together journalists and scholars and policymakers right at the time that we're all most curious and about what's coming ahead. Of course, January is a relatively arbitrary time to pick to reflect and prognosticate, and it's almost impossible to predict. I mean, we would not have predicted the coronavirus dynamic that's going on right now, or even in the beginning of this year, the whole crisis with Iran. But it's still, I think, important to take this time. It's a chance to it helps me at least re-engage with a wider set of issues. Usually I get bogged down into narrow project issues, and a chance to kind of reconsider and maybe reevaluate some of our assumptions about the topics that we follow. So as always, we're hosting this today with the Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. This is their event. They did a lot of the work in pulling together the speakers and panelists. It's just one of the many contributions that they make in this town to our bilateral relationship. And for this, I'd like to thank Ryan Schaefer, the president, and Jim Zumwalt, board chairman, and their team, and to our team, too, for all their hard work in putting this event together. I also want to say a special word of thanks to the National Association of Japan America Societies, NAJAS, and its president, Peter Kelly, who's here. Without their support, this event would not be possible. So thank you, Peter. Well, there you are. And you just celebrated your 10-year anniversary as president of NAJAS, I noticed in my preparations. So I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more as the moderator of the domestic panel later on, but for now I just wanted to welcome everybody to Carnegie and express our enthusiasm about being part of this event today. As a quick outline, we are honored to be joined by Assistant Secretary David Stilwell, who will be our morning keynote speaker, followed by the domestic panel. Then we'll take a short break for lunch. We'll get set up for another keynote presentation and discussion from Hiroyuki Akita of the Nikkei, who is visiting us from Japan. And then we'll have our foreign policy U.S. Japan alliance panel in the afternoon as well, moderated by Jim Zumwalt. So for now, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ryan Schaefer, who I guess next month you'll get to celebrate your 1-year anniversary as president of. It's hard to believe it's already been a year, but thank you so much for what you're doing there, and I'll give you the floor.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming out early on a Friday morning. My name is Ryan Schaefer. I'm president of Japan America Society of Washington, D.C., and funny enough, when I was offered the job or accepted the job last year, it was the first act was to come to this event and take notes on how it was meant to be run for the coming years. So it's in a way, this is my 1-year anniversary today. At any rate, we're really proud to be running our 7th Japan in the Year program. This year, we're calling it the Japan in the Year, A Look at the Year Ahead, which I suppose could be the title for every one that we've done, but that's quite intentional to use this program as a bit of a benchmark early in the year. And then we'll actually take opportunities during the program today to look back at some of the predictions that we made last year and in previous years, which in recent times has gotten more and more challenging. And funny enough, when I ran into to Akita-san last week, who's going to be our lunchtime speaker, I mentioned, well, you better update your talk because now the only thing that people are going to want to hear about is Iran, and that seems like an eternity ago, and it was only last week. So apologies in advance to Akita-san. But very briefly about who we are, since I know that many people aren't necessarily familiar with Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. First, we're pleased to be an associate of the National Association of Japan-America Societies, which is funding today's event, but which also does great work linking a number of Japan-America societies that serve different regions of the country, and we happen to be one of the larger of those serving the Washington, D.C. capital region. But we were formed 62 years ago by diplomats in the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is part of what makes it so special for Assistant Secretary Stilwell to be joining us today. And our mission at the time was to cover all aspects of the U.S. Japan relationship, which is a fairly broad and challenging task. So in recent years, we've been joined in our community by spry young organizations like my former employer, the Mansfield Foundation and Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA and Stimson, who do a really excellent job of covering policy and political affairs. And for the most part, therefore, we leave that good work to them, and we focus our energies on covering the civil society ties that serve as the bedrock of the U.S.-Japan relationship. And how do we do that? We have hundreds of programs through the year, most of which are public, and I hope that you are all taking advantage of them or will. But we have 4 big ones that make us fairly unique and that I think we in the Washington U.S. capital region should be proud of. First off, we host the largest Japanese cultural festival in the United States. That's the Sakura Matsuri Japanese Street Festival, which happens this year will be April 4th. This is a premier event of Washington's National Cherry Blossom Festival. It's also the biggest event of the National Cherry Blossom Festival, usually attracting 30 to 40,000 people to Pennsylvania Avenue, right in the shadow of the U.S. Capitol. This year will be our 60th anniversary, so it's going to be an exciting one for us. I really hope that everybody can attend. The 2 days immediately prior to that, Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. hosts the United States National Japanese Language Championship, which is a program that we call the National Japan Bowl, which is, again, open to the public. Again, I think that we should be proud that we host that in Washington, D.C., not New York, not Los Angeles. We get it here in Washington, D.C., and that's actually a program of national importance that helps to motivate the Japanese language students throughout the country and even around North America. Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. also hosts the annual dinner in November that serves as the kind of, a friend recently called it the U.S. Japan prom. It serves as the gala dinner that celebrates the U.S. Japan bilateral relationship. And we have the largest Japanese language school in the region. So some of our, we have 200 students at any given time over 4 semesters. So please come and study Japanese, or if you're a Japanese business corporate expat, come brush up on your Japanese. We'd be pleased to have you. So on to the program for today, again, this is a program that this is our kind of principal foray into the policy and politics arena. And we try to sneak ours in at the beginning of the year, kind of like Iowa and New Hampshire, while we've got everybody's attention. But it also provides a nice opportunity really to benchmark the state of affairs of the U.S. Japan relationship and take a look at what we think lies ahead, and to put our panelists on the spot to make predictions about what will happen in the year ahead, which almost invariably prove to be wrong, but serves as some fun to look back on in the next year and all the subsequent years in which we plan to hold this program. Peter. At any rate, so we're at 10:15. I've lost track of what time it is now, but we expect the Assistant Secretary in a few minutes to give our morning keynote. That session will be moderated by my boss, our chairman, Ambassador Jim Zumwalt. And then we'll have our first morning panel, which will have an opportunity to reflect a little bit on Assistant Secretary Stilwell's remarks. But for that panel, we're really pleased and honored to have our board counselor, Dr. Sheila Smith, but also Dai Mochinaga and Tobias Harris as well. And Jim will moderate that session. We'll have our keynote over lunch from Hiroyuki Akita from Nikkei, who's excellent, and we're really lucky and pleased to have him. And then our afternoon panel from 2 to 2:30 is not an opportunity for people to go out and take their evening or afternoon meetings, because it's a really good one. Ambassador Zumwalt will moderate a discussion on Japan's foreign policy, featuring Patricia Kim of U.S. Institute of Peace, Masashi Murano from the Hudson Institute, Scott Snyder from the Wilson Center, and Professor Kristen Vicasi from University of Maine, who I'm proud to say is my fellow Mainer to represent the stage this morning. So once again, really pleased to have everybody with us for today. I hope that you stick around for the full event. It'll be a good one. And I'll leave it there and note that we do have a few minutes. Again, the Assistant Secretary is on his way, so take the opportunity now to introduce yourself to your seat companion, and we'll get up and running again once the Assistant Secretary arrives.
Thank you, Ryan. And I should note that we made a slight mistake on our program. Scott Snyder is at the Council on Foreign Relations, not the Wilson Center. So I'll note that for the record. But please, if you like, take this moment. You can get a refresher cup of coffee, and we will get started in about 7 minutes or so. Thank you.
Yeah, just a little bit. A little bit more. Yeah, might as well. Yeah, not to be. I think you checked that box. Not gonna be doing that again for. Yeah, that's the way to go about it.
Okay, everyone, we will get started here in just a minute. Our special guest has arrived.
So as most of you know, I'm Jim Zumwalt, the chairman of the Japan-America Society, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Assistant Secretary David Stilwell today. David is really a soldier diplomat, and the first time I met David was up at Misawa in northern Japan when he was the base commander up there. And I was chargé d'affaires in Embassy Tokyo and had visited many American bases. And the typical modus operandi was to go with the local American commander to visit the governor or mayor. And the governor or mayor was willing to see us, but wanted to control the narratives. There were no photographs, maybe a very short press release, and it was almost as if our visit to the governor didn't exist. Very different in Misawa. The mayor had a photo spray. The entire local press corps was there. We were on the front page of the local paper the next day, and it impressed me to see how much David had worked to generate a positive relationship between the combined base in Misawa and the local community. So I really thought of David in those days as first a soldier, but also a diplomat. And now I think he's maybe flipped things around and is working in the State Department as the senior person in charge of U.S.-Asia relations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce David Stilwell. He'll be speaking for a few moments, and then we'll do a little bit of a Q&A session. So if you have, or you think of some questions, please jot them down or keep them in mind, and we'll try and get to as many people as we can for questions and answers. So David.
Well, Jim, thank you for that generous description. I take full credit for all those great things that really are a product of lots of people who went before me and a very positive attitude on behalf of the Misawa city. You know, a lot of times they would bring mayors from Okinawa up to Misawa to sort of discuss how to how you work effectively with U.S. forces. I was proud to be part of a activity that was so cooperative and basically easy. But I'll take credit. Thank you. To return fire on Jim's story, I'd like to recall a story from that trip that was equally interesting from the warrior diplomat side. So in the fighter pilot, to kind of blow off tensions of the week, on Fridays we would go to the officers club and we'd play a game called Crud. Crud originated in Canada. I can't really reveal the origins, but basically it's a bunch of knucklehead, immature fighter pilots trying to kill each other. And so what they do is you take the cue ball from the game and you just pick one other random ball. And the goal is to put that other ball into a pocket using your hands. You can only shoot from certain ends. There's a lot of rules and techniques involved. Anyway, we got Jim involved in this game of Crud. And, he got body slammed into the wall a couple times. He probably was pretty bruised the next morning. And it was his welcome to the world of military diplomacy. So, Jim, congratulations on surviving that. And good for you. Thank you for that introduction. And again, thanks for the opportunity to lay out the vision for the U.S. Japan relationship for the next year, 2020, a very symmetric number, a number that includes the Olympics and a whole bunch of other great stuff. I feel very privileged to be part of it, and I know we've got lots of good things in store. It's not without challenges, but given all that we've been through in the past, this should be a fantastic year. So there is so much to discuss that I'm going to put on my glasses and run through it as quickly as possible, but I don't want to miss some key things, just to make sure you all are aware of what I know. So thank you also for Japan American Society of Washington, D.C. for organizing this event, and also for the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace for supporting and hosting. Theme today is a look at the year ahead. Let me explain how the U.S.-Japan alliance will stand for global freedom, democracy, prosperity, and security in the year 2020. Okay, first, our alliance is strong, adaptable, and enduring. In 2020, it will continue to evolve to address new challenges, and I know we will put a cherry on top with the execution of the Olympics, and we look forward to supporting in any way we can. Second, we are investing in the bilateral economic relationship. Third, we're working ever closer together to protect our innovation-driven economies, a key driver for future national prosperity and strength. Fourth, we will continue to promote our shared fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, and rule of law in 2020. And finally, leveraging our people-to-people ties, we will build the human capital that powers our lasting prosperity in 2020 and beyond. And the word human capital is operative here, so we'll come back to that. But let's consider each of these in turn. First, a strong alliance. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary last week, and it really is the cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in the region. Security relationship began after World War II in conjunction with the San Francisco Peace Treaty. However, our shared values of democracy, rule of law, and individual liberty require a broader and stronger treaty that would cover security and economic cooperation. And so, January 19th marked the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. From the Cold War to today, our security alliance has evolved to address evolving threats. We used to track Russian MiGs north of Hokkaido on our way up to Wakkanai. Anybody been to Wakkanai? That's awesome. Anyway, that was a very strong memory. And today we track the aggressive expansionism of others in East China and South China Seas. We're not just allies, but we're neighbors and friends. So when disasters like the Great Eastern Japan earthquake strike, we work side by side to swiftly effect recovery. The close ties start at the very top. President Trump and Prime Minister Abe have a genuine friendship that makes the bilateral relationship even stronger. The two have met 5 times in the span of 6 months last year. It's unheard of. We've never seen such frequent exchanges at the national level. President Trump even took back-to-back trips to Japan within a month last summer, first for the new Reiwa era celebration in May, and then right after that, G20 Osaka summit in June. So in short, the alliance has never been stronger. So to grow it in 2020, we know that Japan serves as host to over 50,000 U.S. military personnel and advanced U.S. defense assets, including the U.S. 7th Fleet, enabling both countries to ensure peace and stability in the region and beyond. As Jim said, I spent a total of 6 years up at Misawa in 2 separate tours, and I got to experience that close cooperation firsthand. We rely on our interoperability and our common understanding of our roles and missions and the capabilities needed to accomplish them. In 2019, we further strengthened our security alliance to uphold a rules-based international order and promote the shared values of the American and Japanese people. The hub and spokes model of alliances that has been in force for so long is no longer sufficient to meet the challenges we face, and it's just not enough to cooperate trilaterally or quadrilaterally in small groups with the U.S. as the convening partner. And so our advantage and greatest strength is the ability to network allies and partners. And again, Japan demonstrates this in spades as it conducts outreach to Vietnam and Japan and Philippines and Australia and a number of other countries in the region that, again, we find very helpful and beneficial and benefits Japanese security as well. Japan's efforts to expand port calls in participation exercises, efforts to complete reciprocal access agreements and cross-servicing agreements with U.S. allies, including Australia, as well as Japan's commitment to improve information security across the whole of government will anchor this continued networking prospect. We look forward to continuing to grow Japan's capabilities, and we stand shoulder to shoulder and help Japan stand shoulder to shoulder with us in defense of the rules-based order in the region, including by partnering on Japan's F-2 replacement program to produce the best future fighter for both of us, and certainly for Japan's defense. We welcome Japan's commitment to continue to grow their capabilities and shoulder more responsibility within the alliance for defending a free and open Indo-Pacific, which we once took for granted, but we can no longer do. As a military officer who served in the Pacific, keep saying that, sorry, I believe we should recognize the remarkable evolution that Japan and the alliance as a whole have made over the recent years. However, the threats we face have also evolved, and we know Japan will need to do even more to defend common interests and values. And so in the economic lane, the linkage between our economies, which together account for approximately 30% of a global GDP, that's a big number, is another source of strength in the U.S.-Japan relationship. We are top trading partners, exchanging $300 billion of goods and services each year. The United States is Japan's top source of direct investment, and Japan is the 3rd largest investor in the United States, with $484 billion invested to date across all 50 states. In 2019, we concluded a Phase 1 trade agreement whose terms entered into force on January 1st, and they do provide a level playing field which will benefit American and Japanese consumers. We also reached a separate U.S.-Japan digital trade agreement, a high standard and comprehensive set of provisions addressing priority areas of digital trade. These are areas where our two economies thrive in the global marketplace and where we can together help set common expectations for the world, as this is an area that's just evolving. It's being built as we go. And so our cooperation on this and Japan's expertise in this realm are going to be hugely important. But we're not stopping there. In 2020, we'll build on the Phase 1 trade agreement and pursue a comprehensive trade deal with Japan. Comprehensive negotiations will include customs duties and other restrictions on trade, barriers to trade in services and investment, and other issues in order to promote mutually beneficial, fair, and reciprocal trade. They will also address ongoing issues in key American goods and services export sectors. When we strengthen our bilateral economic relationship, we strengthen the foundations upon which our alliance and partnership rest. More broadly, economic cooperation, connectivity underpins economic growth and prosperity. And for several years now, under President Trump and Prime Minister Abe's leadership, we've been expanding our economic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world. In 2020, we will leverage our bilateral partnerships, the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, or JUSEP, and the Japan-U.S. Strategic Digital Economy Partnership, or JUSTEP, say those fast, to extend cooperation with the private sector and third countries to support high-quality infrastructure, energy, and digital projects. On the energy front, we want the people of the Mekong region to have power at home, at work, and at school, just like Americans and Japanese do. So in 2020, we plan to begin implementing the Japan-U.S. Mekong Power Partnership, JUMP, another acronym for you, Secretary Pompeo and Japanese Foreign Minister Motegi announced in August of last year. On the digital connectivity side, we intend to facilitate policy and technical collaboration between U.S. and Japanese cities and Indo-Pacific cities, in particular the 26 cities in the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. Our cities will learn and grow together as the world enters the digital age. In all of our economic efforts, we will continue to place the private sector at the forefront and leverage the new $60 billion U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, and its partnerships with U.S. and Japanese counterpart agencies to ensure that when the U.S. and Japanese companies work together in the Indo-Pacific and around the world, they bring both the best solutions and the best possible financial terms. Innovation, improvement, where we're going, how we're going to advance this. The United States and Japan are both blessed with hard-won, advanced, innovation-driven economies. Our scientific communities are just as connected as these economies. At the government level, we're investing in research collaboration. Scientists at our national laboratories are engaged in collaboration on basic research that we hope will do amazing things like cure brain cancer. At the same time, our university professors and engineers are collaborating on other research and development that's driving advances in material sciences, advanced computing, and much more. These are mutually beneficial, these are cooperative, and both sides truly win. It's the definition of win-win. And these are the kinds of scientific advances that are going to help put U.S. and Japanese astronauts on Mars someday. That's a reach goal. More immediately, this innovation powers our economic prosperity and our national security. U.S. and Japanese firms are among those developing some of the most exciting technologies out there. Often these technologies are sensitive and with critical infrastructure and security implications. So there are those out there conducting rampant theft of cutting-edge research and intellectual property, and it's not just a problem for the particular company that's affected. This undermines the entire innovation economy that we have in the United States and in Japan. We just were with Secretary last week in Silicon Valley learning more about this, how industry is growing, but how it also needs to defend itself further. And so we must ensure that our decisions today will allow our continued prosperity and security. All of us should take to heart the warning that a boxing referee issues to both fighters at the beginning of the fight. And it's, gentlemen, protect yourself at all times. You just cannot assume that everybody out there has good intent. Those threats become more and more obvious by the day. Increasingly, we in the U.S. and Japan and Japanese governments are looking for opportunities to come together with the business and academic communities to respond to these threats. And I will do more of this in 2020. We will work ever closer with Japan to ensure that Japanese technology, too, stays in the right hands and is not used to undermine our collective national security. We will continue to strengthen our cyber defenses and help partners do the same. We will strengthen and enhance information security practices across the whole of government to preserve our shared economic and defense advantages in the face of evolving threats to our alliance. This will include enhanced efforts to ensure supply chain security, to overcome threats to defense industrial base, threats to national networks, and other critical infrastructure required for military mission assurance and economic prosperity. Governance. This wasn't an issue not so long ago, but recent events have caused us to reflect on what it is that makes Japan and the U.S. so strong, and what it is that makes us cooperate and speak together in a single language that we all understand, and it has to do with the democratic process. So in 2020, we will promote fundamental shared values such as freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, and support Indo-Pacific partners' counterterrorism and maritime security efforts. We will coordinate on capacity-building efforts with partner maritime agencies in the Indo-Pacific. We will support Indo-Pacific nations' efforts to improve their maritime domain awareness, for example, through coastal surveillance systems. You know, fisheries are a huge area it's a natural resource for small countries in the Pacific, and yet they have no way of knowing what's going on in their EEZs and who's taking their fish, and this is an area where we definitely need to cooperate to ensure stability. In 2020, we'll continue to work with allies and partners to protect the freedom of the seas. Whether it's in the East or South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca, or the Indian Ocean, the Horn of Africa, the United States and Japan will continue to stand for freedom of navigation, overflight, and other lawful uses of the sea in 2020. The United States welcomes Japan's decision to dispatch Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force assets to the Middle East. We look forward to staying in close coordination with Japan to ensure a safe and free flow of commerce and freedom of navigation in that critical region. Finally, human capital. My favorite subject, since we haven't really thought about it much, but it's something where we dominate. It's the reason that people come to our countries, because they want to share and do what we do. So the U.S. Japan relationship stands on a solid foundation of grassroots people-to-people relations. Japanese and Americans visiting, studying, and investing in each other's countries are a tremendous cultural, economic, and strategic investment in the future health of the alliance. From our shared national pastime, baseball, to the popularity of anime and manga, our cultures have grown richer from the exchange. Each spring, the Cherry Blossom Festival casts the city in a wash of pink as the stately cherry trees, a gift from then Tokyo Mayor Yukio Ozaki in 1910, bloom around the tidal basin. On the cultural front, the Studio Ghibli films are blockbusters in the United States, and American musicians' shows sell out in many venues across Japan. We would be hard-pressed to find a country with as many Star Wars aficionados as there are in Japan. So for human capital, what this means is that an educated and empowered citizenry like we have in our countries is a requisite for freedom and prosperity. In 2020, the United States and Japan will continue to help people learn the skills they need to participate in this growing, innovative global economy, creating conditions for self-reliance. For many years, we have worked hand in hand with Japan to invest in human capital, and we will continue doing so in 2020. Finally, the Olympics. 2020 will be known as the year Japan hosted the Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games in Tokyo for the second time. Hosting the 1964 Olympics symbolized the country's reemergence on the global stage as a champion of peace. Japan in 2020 embodies the Olympic values of excellence, freedom, and respect. Excellence in design, for example, which visitors and athletes will admire in all the Olympic venues. Friendship among peoples of all nations, starting in sport and growing into an appreciation of humanity's common aspirations, despite our varied backgrounds and unique cultural traditions, and respect for athletes and officials, fellow fans, and fellow citizens in this world we share. Respect also for rule of law, freedom of expression, and human rights. These are all critical, and I know we will be able to emphasize these during the summer. In celebration of this defining moment in Japan's history, our embassy's Go for Gold campaign brings Olympians, Paralympians, and other athletes to local communities that will host Team USA. It sends American diplomats into Japanese classrooms around the country and empowers teachers through special programs. Go for Gold celebrates our shared love of sports. It encourages Japanese students to cheer for Team USA and inspires them to study in the United States. It is more than a celebration of sports. It's about the next generation of Japanese and Americans learning from each other. My daughter, Janae, just spent the spring semester of this year at 19 at Keio University experiencing the full-on effect of life in Japan. She was born there, by the way, in Misawa, and she really enjoyed the experience so much that she just went back to see her friends. So in conclusion, while the U.S.-Japan relationship is built on a legacy of success, ours is so much more than a legacy relationship. It is a deep, broad, mature, and a global partnership. The United States and Japan are working closely together to build a future of prosperity, openness, and freedom. In 2020, we will deepen the grassroots ties that make up the foundation of our partnership, celebrating Japan's hosting of the Olympics and Paralympics. We will strengthen our bilateral economic relationship by working on a comprehensive trade deal. On that foundation, we will work together in the region and around the world to be a force for transparency, accountability, openness, prosperity, and peace. We face ever-evolving threats, but by continuing to evolve our alliance, we will meet these future challenges and our free and open systems will prevail. By continuing to work together in 2020 to support freedom, democracy, and security in the region and around the world, we will position the United States and Japan for greatness now and in the future. Thank you for your patient attention, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you very much for that very broad and comprehensive view of U.S.-Japan relations. I was struck how several times, both at the beginning and the end of your speech, you used the word evolved to describe our relationship. And certainly in 1960, when President Eisenhower had to cancel his visit to Japan because of the huge opposition to the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, it's sort of hard to imagine that today, where there's tremendous support in Japan, not only for our security alliance, but for a positive relationship with the United States. But I think it's safe to predict, because we're supposed to make predictions today, that things will continue to evolve. But I'm going to put you on the spot now and ask, if you could look sort of 5 years down the road, where would you like to see our relationship evolve? What sorts of milestones would you like to achieve?
I mentioned earlier this move from hub and spoke to network type security and other relationships. And so in 5 years, I look forward to seeing, and as Japan already has in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and other places, continue to take the lead and work as a no-kidding partner. The evolution, as you mentioned, started off in a somewhat imbalanced relationship as it had to. But what we've seen is Japan emerge as a very strong economic partner. Certainly, as I mentioned, JUMP and JUSTEP and JUSEP, and a whole bunch of other things in terms of infrastructure in Southeast Asia and beyond. And so the evolution, I believe, from hub and spoke to network puts Japan clearly on the map as one of those key nodes in a network of security, economic security, and human capital. Again, we'll talk about that more and more through the year, but I think what Japan has to offer is fantastic.
Thank you. You also, so speaking more about networks, who are the other likely partners of the United States and Japan in this network that you envision?
Well, let's just look at the Quad right now. I mean, I know that has a maybe checkered past, but the movement and the continued meetings that we're seeing and the interest on the part of all India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. is undeniable. And so, I mean, this reflects that idea of the Indo-Pacific, right? Free and open. The free and open concept is something that we actually, was a Japan idea that we incorporate into our own strategy. And so that's a huge area. Those key nodes in the Quad, each with its own special capabilities, its regional approaches and all the rest, as we all pursue common interests, ideas that have come more sharply into focus recently due to a changing strategic environment.
When Japanese Defense Minister Kono was in Washington recently, and he was asked about networking and asked to list the potential partners of Japan, I was struck that the first country he mentioned was South Korea.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are challenges there,
Sure.
but obviously opportunities. But could you talk a little bit about both the opportunities and the risks in the Japan-Korea relationship, and what can the United States do to try and maximize the benefits of a better partnership?
Well, so for the threats to the region, any seams, any discord encourages North Korea and others to take advantage of that, maybe to actually try to drive wedges in those relationships. So for the, from the very start, we need to get that relationship, back on friendly terms and moving forward, not so much looking backwards. Certainly both sides have a role to play in that. I'm happy that the foreign minister, now defense minister, mentioned that as that's a positive development. And I do believe that both sides understand the importance of advancing that relationship, getting it back into the healthy reign. And it has, right? Since last August, we've seen progress in getting back there. These issues are going to come up. I'm glad we were able to do our part to help bring them together, not mediate. That's not our role. But certainly, especially in Northeast Asia, we're stronger together. If anybody's ever read the book, The Eurasian Century by Nadège Roland, it details amazing amount of work by both Japan and Korea in Central Asia, in developing infrastructure, partnerships, and all the rest. That's an area I'd love to capitalize on, too.
And then, of course, one of the challenges that all three of us, Japan, United States, and South Korea, face is North Korea. And could you talk a little bit about the year ahead and what you hope to see, and what are some of the risks and opportunities in our relationships with North Korea?
I enlisted in the Air Force. I couldn't do anything else in Los Angeles. I kind of hit a wall. So I joined the Air Force wanting to be a jet mechanic in the worst way. And my recruiter, who looked a lot like Pinocchio, said there are no jet mechanic jobs to be had, but you could be a linguist. Well, it turns out I became a Korean linguist. And so starting in 1981, I spent a lot of time on the Korean Peninsula, in this case, looking directly at the threat from the north. I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is an administration that understands that you negotiate from a position of strength, and that some countries just don't appreciate. You certainly want to negotiate with some cultures and countries in a way that shows cooperation and compromise and all that stuff, but there's others who only understand strength. And so The more that the three specific, Korea, Japan, and the U.S. can maintain a solid position, establish what we want, follow through on the Singapore agreement, and then wait until the regime in Pyongyang decides to follow through. That's our best approach. So I think we're in a good place. I've been challenged on that, saying, "Why are you so optimistic?" Things are compared to where they were, certainly in 81 or in 2015 when I left the Pentagon in uniform. Personally, I think we're in a really good position. We've definitely showed North Korea that we can say no, Hanoi, we can walk away, and that our expectations are that they will live up to their commitments in Singapore.
Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could identify yourself and your affiliation, and also I'll start with people who have short questions in order to try and maximize the number of people we ask. So I'll start with you here and then go to you over here. Yes.
Thank you, sir. As you were a prominent military background.
Sorry, could you your name and affiliation?
Sorry. My name is Dong-Yeon Kim from Voice of America Korean Service. You talked about the North Korean calculus, and since North Korea has designated a new foreign minister, Sung-Kwan Lee, which is a hardliner in North Korea, how do you evaluate that situation? And there is discussion in Washington D.C. about Japan having a permanent combined forces command that can represent their voice on the peninsula. And I was just wondering how this discussion is going up in the government level in the United States. Thank you.
I was asked the same question on North Korea earlier this week during press availability. And, I guess we can do criminology and read shadows on walls and all those things. The intel world is doing good work on identifying key players in the regime. I don't care to speculate. I have no idea who this person is, and I really don't. I mean, it doesn't affect my life. We have a Korean-focused special representative office that deals with those things, focused on North Korea. So I don't want to get out ahead of the lights. There was a change. I think that in itself indicates something. I hope it's positive to say maybe we should change our tack and come to the table and have the discussions that we committed to. This isn't just about U.S. and North Korea. It's not just about U.S., South Korea and North Korea. It's about the United Nations. It's the world telling them that we need to get beyond this. The second one on, I'll leave that to General Abrams in Seoul. This is an ongoing conversation. And again, I'm a diplomat, so I'm going to let that one go.
You say that with a smile.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go over here then.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intel analyst and a former diplomat. Wondering if Jisomiya will survive the year, and wondering if Japan is very uncomfortable with the OPCON transfer.
So the Jisomiya, we were very happy to see that the ROK continues this very important aspect of certainly U.S. ROK cooperation.
And sorry, could you maybe explain, because some people may not know what the Jisomiya is and what the value is?
The General Something of Military Information Agreement. General Security, yeah. Basically, it's a trilateral sharing agreement that allows, say, missile information that South Korea has to be shared both with the U.S. and with Japan, as we all focus on something that we all agree on is the unhelpfulness of North Korean long-range missiles and other developments, which, again, the United Nations has said they should not pursue. And so the Jisomiya is important in making sure that we can defend ourselves, but also as a strong message to North Korea that they unhelpful launches and all those things are unacceptable. So Korea has continued that. We're happy that they have, and we continue to urge Korea and South Korea and Japan to work through these issues, historical and otherwise. Ongoing, again, I'm going to have to defer to General Abrams. We talk about it when I go to Seoul. I dealt with it in 2015, well, in 14. I'm not going to speak for Japan on that. So.
Okay, another question. Okay, we'll go here and then in the back over there.
Good morning. I'm Evan Carlick. I'm a Navy officer with Georgetown Center for Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Studies. I'm wondering if the U.S. State Department has any nascent programs to work with Japan to improve human security, economic prosperity, and so forth in Pacific Island states. Thank you.
Thinking. There may be, I'm not sure. Obviously, Pacific Islands is one of those areas where France has interest, New Zealand, Australia all have interest. Japan has interests too in the peace and security in that region. But I'll just say the bulk of my work with Japan in this job has been in Southeast Asia. There's lots of potential there, as I mentioned, in areas. I'm not aware. That doesn't mean there's not. I'm just not aware. I can't speak to that right now.
Okay, a question was over here, I think, on the aisle towards the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Koji Sonoda with the Japan's Asahi newspaper. My question is on burden sharing with Japan. And so the negotiation on host nation support with Japan will start officially this year. So I have two quick questions. I was just wondering if the U.S. has already requested that Japan should pay from 4 to 5 times of the current defense cost sharing. And also secondly, what is the principal stance of the U.S. on host nation support negotiation this year? Thank you.
If only Washington was hermetically sealed, and if only rumors didn't have legs. The president's been very clear on his insistence, not just on Korea, Japan, but on NATO and others, to live up to commitments to adjust contributions based on the region, threats, and capabilities in order to balance the fact that America spends 4% of its GDP on defense, and others, such as NATO, have committed to 2%, but in many cases have yet to live up to that number. And so, I think there's things to be learned from the negotiation going on right now with the ROK. As you mentioned, the Japan Host Nation Support Agreement will be up for renegotiation. Again, I'm not going to prejudice the outcomes or the negotiators' position, as we have not even begun that process in the case of Japan, ongoing with Korea. But again, I think we should all reflect on the fact that the security situation in the region is definitely different than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that the capabilities, as I mentioned in the speech, of our alliance friends, to contribute have also increased.
Thank you. Okay, a question over here behind the camera.
Hee-Jung Yang from Radio Free Asia. Another question about North Korea. North Korean official is going to attend for the first time to the Munich Security Conference next month. I'm wondering if U.S. government is, I understand that Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper are going to be there. So any engagement opportunity?
I'll answer that briefly is none that I'm aware of. I know the Secretary is going, and we're helping him prep for that, because he will meet with other counterparts while he's there. But the North Korean question hasn't come to my attention yet.
You have a question in the very back row?
Thank you for this. Bill Clifford with the World Affairs Councils of America. I have a question and a related question regarding human capital and how the U.S. can help position Japan and the alliance for further greatness. And that's, to what extent does Japan's daunting demographic challenges play in the minds of our military and diplomats with respect to military service, and also, say, issues like pensions and what it means for the Japanese economy? And related to that, people say one solution is Japan should open its doors to more immigration, but is the U.S. ability to ask for that, and is the U.S. perception, not only in Japan and in the region, changed because of what happens on our border?
Wow. Okay. The demographic question is probably the easiest, so we'll start with that. As you look at advanced economies, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, U.S., Japan, and others, you see birth rates decline. That just, I'm not a sociologist, but that just seems like, as you get more wealthy, the need to have lots and lots of kids goes down. And so I think we should all look at, creative ways of addressing these things. One way is automation. One way is immigration. I went through Tokyo, went through Narita Customs recently, and there were folks that were hired to do screening, and the process went slick. It was real easy getting through customs there. I would say that's a positive step in addressing these human capital and the need for the human touch. But I do think there's also opportunities to learn from others who are facing the same issues. And you mentioned the border issues. The great thing about human capital, and the one I point to most often, is that while some countries build walls to keep their people in, prevent them from leaving, I'm in some ways happy that we do build walls to keep people out. It shows this attractiveness of what we have in this country, that people like the opportunity to come here and be part of this. And we're a nation of immigrants. We appreciate immigration, but that immigration must be controlled. You can't just throw your borders open. Europe thought that was a good idea, right? And now you look at they're having second thoughts on that. And so now for an island nation, it's a little bit easier to manage immigration. So kind of stitching those all together, we find great benefit in incorporating diverse views, cultures, and people. And I think as population shrink, that's one solution you'll have to look at.
One question against the wall in the very, very back.
Good morning, sir. My name is Nissim Rubin. I'm from the American Jewish Committee. Sir, we have seen over the years Japan has built very good relations with Israel. They're also one of the largest donors to the Palestinian Authority. Next week, we expect Prime Minister Netanyahu and General Benny Gantz to come to Washington. And besides the quartet, would there be a more substantive role for Japan in the Middle East peace process engagement? I think they are great supporters of U.S. initiatives in this regard. So, thank you.
One of the subjects I raised today and talk about a lot is the concept of like-mindedness. And we do have a lot of partners who, although not governance structure not being identical, is very much alike. It believes in the inherent value of the individual and all those things that are being challenged today by others who have a different view on that. And so wherever Japan can cooperate and help in varying regions of the world, we absolutely can't object to that. We do share the same ideas. As far as this particular subject, I'm going to have to claim, I'm doing this a lot, claiming ignorance. But look, it's hard enough to keep a handle on what goes on in East Asia Pacific, much less Palestine and Israel. So again, I will defer on that, except to note that on many of these things, we share common interests. Japan's commitment to participate in security outside of the region, those things are all very helpful.
I think we have time for two more questions. Okay, one here on the, yes, right here, and then maybe that will be the last question then. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Hong Gyu-yeol from South Korean media, MBC TV. On North Korea, recently, senior State Department officials said that North Korea, U.S. pursues slow, patient, steady diplomacy. Could you explain what that means? Is that different from the Obama administration's strategic patience?
Right. The idea is there's nothing complicated about it. Patient diplomacy means that we know, having seen how negotiations have gone in the past, that there was going to be times when the lights are on and the volume is up and we're moving forward, and due to internal politics or whatever inside Pyongyang, it's going to then go on kind of a hiatus and wait. We've seen in the past that it may be impatience or a need to resolve these things, or a sense to we want to resolve them sooner, has had us then come to them and abandon our whatever position we had. Again, as I said before, I like the fact that we aren't in a rush and that we've stated our position, we've made our agreements, and then we're going to insist that the other side follow through with those. And it seems to be working.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think everyone in this room would agree that U.S. relationship with countries in Asia is incredibly important to the United States, and we appreciate what you and your team at the East Asia Bureau are doing to nurture those relationships. So let's give, and we appreciate your willingness to come and share your thoughts with us today. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you. That's great. And thanks so much for arranging this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to just take a couple of minutes to reset the stage, and we will reconvene at 11 a.m. Okay, everyone, sorry to interrupt, but we are going to resume our program with the domestic panel. So if you can take your seats, we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, thank you again for joining us today. I think my microphone is working well. Appreciate that. Getting a thumbs up from back there. So welcome again. And I was thinking in preparation for the domestic panel. I go back and forth from year to year doing the domestic panel and the international panel, but I kind of like the domestic panel. And last year was really sexy, as Minister Koizumi likes to say. We had the new emperor coming in, the Reiwa era. We had an election to look forward to. We had a consumption tax. We had a variety of things we knew were going to happen in the coming year. And this year we don't have a whole lot. We know there are going to be a lot of important developments domestically, and there are a lot of machinations and dynamics that are at play, but other than the Olympics, it's not quite as much of a banner year. Because last year we talked a little bit about, it was the year of the boar, and it was the overlap of local elections and the upper house elections, which traditionally has been a big shift or a kind of a dynamic election, and we did not see that too much. But I have a great group of people with me today to kind of look at all these, maybe not sexy, but still really important dynamics going on in Japan on the domestic front. So I'm very pleased, and I'll introduce them in order, I guess, of their opening discussions. Tobias Harris, to my left, he's a senior vice president now at Teneo Intelligence, covering Japan, and he's also a fellow for Economy, Trade, and Business at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. And among previous jobs, other previous jobs, he worked a while back for Diet member Keiichiro Asao in the upper house in Japan. And one of the main reasons I really wanted to get Tobias back, this is, I think, his second time as part of our program, but he has a new book coming out this year on Abe, Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. So I think that comes out in April, at least there.
Outside of the U.S., so waiting on U.S. details. But.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you about that in a second. But we have also, of course, Sheila Smith. Thank you so much for joining us. You're here almost every year because we really like and respect you. No, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Sheila is, of course, a senior fellow for Japan at the Council on Foreign Relations, the same place where Scott Snyder is from, despite what it says in the program. And she's also has a new book that came out late last year called Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power. And of course, before that, she had another really good book, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics in a Rising China. So looks at Japan from a variety of angles, but really knows the politics and the people and the country well. She's also vice chair of the U.S. advisors to the U.S. Japan Conference on the Cultural and Educational Exchange, Interchange, CULCON, which is an important organization. So glad to have you here, Sheila. And we have a new face to join us today, and so glad that Dai Mochinaga was able to join us today. Dai is a senior researcher at the Keio Research Institute from last year, and before that spent about a decade at the Mitsubishi Research Institute in Tokyo. He specializes in technology and cyber policy issues. He's a computer science engineer with a recent emphasis on cybersecurity. He also has a book, I guess a few years ago, or
2 years ago.
2 years ago, Rulers of Cyberspace, Power Across Borders. So we're definitely going to get into some of the technology issues today, which is something that here at Carnegie we've been spending a lot more time looking at. So I'm going to turn to Tobias first to kind of set a relatively broad table, get us started, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists, and then have a little conversation here, and then bring in the audience. So Tobias, over to you.
All right, thanks, Jim. Thank you, Japan-America Society of Washington, for doing this again. I mean, this is really a great event to do every year, and to really get people thinking about what's going to matter this year. And of course, to Carnegie Endowment for giving us a place to have this conversation and facilitating it. I'd like to say that I could correct Jim and say that there are, there's some sexy issue domestically in Japan, but I mean, the reality is that, in some ways, this is Abe's sort of perfect moment on the world stage. He's going to get the Olympics he's wanted. If you read his writings going back really a long time, the Olympics are, this is not something that's incidental. I mean, he really views this as an important moment. He's got strong memories of what the 1964 Olympics were like when he was 10 years old. And this is going to be, I think for him in his mind, this is the Japan is back Olympics. He came back in 2013, came here to DC, said Japan, I'm back and Japan shall be. I mean, this is going to be his moment to show off a Japan that he thinks has found its confidence. But in that sense, this is sort of going to be peak Abe. This is going to be his sort of the peak moment of his career, the peak moment of this premiership. But the flip side of that is that there's not really much to expect beyond that. He's going to have this great symbolic moment in the world stage, but domestically, you look at his agenda for the coming year. There's not a whole lot of ambition left. He's sort of past the moments where there was a lot of energy in Abenomics, where he really had sort of a strong impetus to push reforms through. That already now you have the political discussion shifting to his term ends in September of 2021. He himself has named some of the key contenders. That's really where I think attention is starting to shift. I mean, I think you're not really seeing that heat up because I think everyone is sort of in the tent, and so no one is really working to push him out ahead of his time. But there's not really any reason to think that the main sources of his strength are going to change. And so I'm going to go through that. Again, so for one, the LDP is united behind him. There's not, you have kind of these names here. No one. The divisions have essentially been tamed. I mean, I think this is, we're really seeing that after 7 years of Abe centralizing control of the party, of policymaking, of candidate selection, of party financing. I mean, no one really had, there's no real source of strength within the party to challenge him. And we saw this sort of late last year. One of Abe's closest allies, Amari Akira, now he's the head of the LDP Tax Commission, which was one of these last great strongholds of resistance. Even that's sort of been brought under the fold. And so here he is, he's popular, the party knows they need, that he's won elections for them. They're not going to defy him. There's not really any reason to defy him. You see that even in the midst of scandal, right? You've had a diet session late last year that a lot of discussion of scandal. One, he was still able to get things through the diet. He got the U.S. Japan trade agreement through the diet. There were some other bits of legislation that got through. The scandals didn't get in the way of that. And during the recess between the end of the session last year and the start of this session now, his approval ratings actually have bounced back a bit. So you're not really seeing any room really for the LDP to push back against him or to try to kind of start nudging him to the side. The other source of strength really is that you're not seeing the opposition make any headway, despite despite some of the scandals that have come along. You've had talks between the two main DPJ successor parties, the Constitutional Democrats and the Democratic Party for the People, that have been going on now for a couple months. And despite talk that by the start of the diet session that they would find a way through that, it hasn't happened. And there's no real reason to think that these parties, which have languished in the single digits, are going to suddenly enjoy a bloom of popularity once they get, if they find a way to join forces again. I mean, there's not really any reason to think that the obstacles that the DPJ faced when it went back into opposition in 2012, that a new opposition party would be able to find a way to regain the trust of the public. I mean, and that there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, part of it is that Abe, I think, has been quite skillful in occupying sort of the center in terms of policy. I mean, he's taken, I think, a number of policy positions that first surfaced on the opposition side. This idea of, for example, a social security system for all generations, that was an opposition idea that had been kicked around on the opposition side for a while, and he kind of has grabbed that and made that his agenda item. There's not really a policy there's not really policy room for the opposition to grab hold of. I think there's long memories of what the DPJ's years in power were like, and I think people are a little wary of what the opposition would be like when it comes to foreign policy. And Abe has been, I think, a pretty steady hand, as we'll hear more about this afternoon. Opposition can't really oppose him on that front. And really, despite some of these scandals and questions about influence peddling and whether you've had corruption at the highest levels, I mean, the public, I think, hasn't been convinced by the government's explanations for the scandals, but that hasn't necessarily meant that the public is ready then to say, well, we trust the opposition more. I mean, I think the Abe government has generally been seen as competent and really better than any alternative out there, and that there's no sign that that's going to change this year. I mean, that the opposition, I think, in some ways, you'd need a turnover of people, and we haven't really had that yet. So, I mean, really, one possibility that's been discussed this year, I mean, as of now, there's no plans for an election. There's no upper house elections, no local elections. There's discussion of a snap election. Even if you saw a snap election, it's very unlikely that the outcome would look any different than in 2017 or in 2014 when you had record low turnout, people just deciding to stay home, and no one really, the opposition not really being able to get, opposition needs to get independent voters out. Those voters, there's no reason to think they would come out in the event of a snap election. And so if you got a snap election in the second half of this year after the Olympics, chances are you'd have another stable LDP Komeito majority, quite possibly another supermajority that Abe then would be able to hand to a successor, presumably. So despite the fact, with this political stability, and maybe because of this political stability, you're not really going to see a lot of risk-taking, I think, in terms of domestic policy making. Abenomics, we can still talk about it existing as sort of the government's program, but I mean, at this point, what we've seen and we're going to see in the coming weeks as the government moves its budgets through the Diet, I mean, what you have now is a situation where I think the Japanese economy is heavily dependent on government spending for growth, and it's heavily dependent on loose monetary policy, and none of those conditions is going to change this year. The government has unveiled, depending on how you calculate it, I mean, it's at least somewhere in the order of 12 trillion. If you ask, Abe calls it 26 trillion, but it's not all of that's new government spending. But either way, you're getting a big stimulus program, again, that's supposed to run through the end of this fiscal year, or the next fiscal year, which starts on April 1st. So you'll get more, government spending really right up until the end of Abe's term as LDP leader. That's just the reality. I mean, I think Abe can boast of a pretty good economic record. I mean, it's hard to say that this has been a third lost decade, and that people are feeling a little more confident. Employment is record highs. Lots of people employed. Employers really struggling to find workers in a lot of different sectors. That's a real achievement. Tax revenues are up. Corporate profits are up. There are all sorts of signs, and Abe likes to tout these numbers, and they're real achievements. But then looking forward and looking at who's going to succeed him, last year you saw a dramatic drop in the number of births, and so the demographic challenges are still there. There's still this question of how Japan's going to provide health care and pensions for its retirement. Abe's talking about Social Security reform this year, but is it fundamental reform? No, and it looks more like tinkering in the margins, making it possible for older Japanese to keep working and then to delay taking their pensions, so maybe to ease some of the burden on the Social Security system. But even then, some of that legislation is going to wait for the fall, and there's always the chance of a delay. So we're not looking at a really aggressive Social Security reform agenda. This is something that one of his successors is going to take on. So I think it's safe to say at this point that really this year we're going to get a real, we're going to get a good look at what Abe's legacy is as a domestic statesman. Stable, competent government, the economy growing, not robustly, not with a new growth model, but enough to say that the prospects for a lot of Japanese have improved relative to the past. More women in the workforce, maybe a little more mobility. But the grand experiment, I think we can say, hasn't quite worked. We haven't seen the shift to a more consumer-led growth model. The government, Japan's economy is still dependent on growth. You have, politically, you have post-populist politics, which maybe is a good thing compared to a lot of other democracies, but maybe Japan needs some of the robust political competition that in some ways led to Abe in the first place, right? Abe came back because the LDP was in opposition, needed something to distinguish itself, to make a case against the DPJ. And Abe came along with sort of this new economic experiment, and it enabled Abe to come back, and then enabled the LDP to come back. That's a pretty strong argument in favor of robust two-party democracy. And I don't think we're going to see that come back this year. Maybe in 2021, as you transition to a new leader, there's space for the opposition to say, the LDP maybe is not all it's cracked up to be. But at home, I don't think you're going to see a lot of kind of dramatic change. This afternoon you'll hear about how busy the international agenda is, and I think there's maybe still room for Abe to shape a more expansive legacy abroad. But at home, I don't think we're going to see it.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you very much. And you covered all the issues I was hoping you would touch on, but you left some for Sheila to dive deeper.
Not really.
Into. So,
just go home.
Okay. The jockeying for position. I wonder if you can get a little bit more deeply, maybe, into some of the political folks who are looking to succeed Abe. And constitutional revision was not touched on. There's a handful of things. Maybe you could dive a little deeper and give us your thoughts.
Happy to do it. Hi, everybody. Hope you're not remembering what we said last year. We're a blank slate. So let me just to pick up on Tobias's comments about Abe and his legacy. And I think it's always wise because we have these meetings every year. We get very fixated on the short term. But remember, he came back into power in 2012, and his reputation outside the country was, here comes the nationalist, right? Japan, evidence that Japan is shifting to the right. We had that conversation for several years, remember, because in 2015, it was the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. So Abe came back into power just as the region was very focused on historical legacy issues, and lots of people were a little worried about his ideological proclivities to be a more nationalistic revisionist voice for Japan. Now, in 2020, he's the savior of the liberal world order. He is Mr. Magic. He is negotiating trade agreements. He has stabilized Japan. He has given the Japanese people, although there are certain people who take issue with this, but he's given the Japanese people reason for hope. Measured hope, to be sure, but certainly much better than I think a lot of Japanese felt in 2012. I would go, and I'm sure Tobias and others have went to Japan in that period, and there was a new sense of optimism in a couple of years after Abe had been in office. And Abenomics has its ups and its downs, its successes and failures. The successes, I think, are slow and gradual, but I think one of the ones that I would say was really important for Japan was to get the Japanese people to look optimistically about their future again. And also on the security side, more and more Japanese were extraordinarily worried about the region, about how and who was going to lead them in this more difficult time and space. And then, of course, more recently, who is going to manage the more difficult and less predictable U.S. president. So Abe has navigated a lot of expectation, a lot of cynicism about his leadership, and I think he's done it remarkably well. Nonetheless, more recently you go to Tokyo and there's been ups and downs with scandals and cronyism in 2017, that set of scandals, and it's back again with the cherry blossom viewing, right? Again, the word that pops up a lot in my conversations with executives and companies and scholars and others is a little bit of Abe fatigue, right? He's been around for a long time, and that's a good thing for Japan, but in the general kind of how do we make politics sexy again kind of theme, maybe not so good. So I think there is a little bit of that. People are ready for transition, and nobody is more ready for transition than the people coming up below him in the Liberal Democratic Party. So these are the people that are really ready for their own time of leadership for Japan and to have a bigger voice in the future, not only of the party, but also how to move the reform agenda forward. So you've got some fairly technocratic and interesting people coming up. It's hard to say after 8 years of Prime Minister Abe whether they're going to fill those shoes in the same way globally. But you've got the 3 foreign ministers, right? Kishida, the current foreign minister Motegi, and of course the current defense minister, former foreign minister Konotaro. Those are the names that come up. Those 3 people would be very articulate spokespersons for Japan's economic policy, but also for Japan's role in the world. So I tend to go, Japan needs a global voice. Those 3 people would give Japan a pretty articulate an effective global voice. But then you have the other two, Mr. Suga, who has been the Chief Cabinet Secretary, and then Mr. Kato, who is a little bit more aligned with the base of support for the Abe prime ministership, a little bit more on the conservative nationalist side. So you've got people who would work well with the bureaucracy and in the party, the more political managers of the Abe reign, right? Those two. I don't know. I can't predict, although Jim is going to force us to predict later on. So I'll wait for Jim to make us do that. But there's always the anti-Abe. There's a little space under certain circumstances, of course, for Ishiba Shigeru to really find some ground here. I think it would take some setbacks between now and the next election for Ishiba to have that space, quite honestly. I'm not sure he's in the strongest position possible inside the party. And I'm sure that's a diplomatic way of saying that. But I think that, remember, when you elect a leader of the LDP, it is not just the Nagata Chogin, the Diet members, right, who get that say. Depending on how the next leader is selected, Ishiba could have considerable room among the party members to advocate against the Abe platform. And so don't rule Mr. Ishiba out. He's still there, and I think there's a certain amount of party members who would like to see a little bit more robust pushback on the agenda of the prime minister. Nonetheless, I think Tobias is largely correct that this is going to be a pretty strong effort within the party towards managed succession, right? And you're hearing lots of our political reporters talk in that kind of language, if not that word itself. Interesting piece of the question for me, though, is when the LDP goes back to a general election, most likely, I think, at the end of 2020, after the success of the Olympics, and we're all kind of predicting it'll be on a wave of accomplishment for the prime minister. He will hand the baton to somebody else, and then they will, with his blessing, take the party to general election, or slightly reversed, he'll take the party to a general election and then hand the baton over, one of the two. So that's a late 2020. Some people take issue with that, saying, no, there's another scenario, a third scenario that's become a little bit more popular in Japan, and that's the Trump Kaisan. In other words, the outcome of our election could factor into the way in which the party thinks about Mr. Abe. And maybe there'll be enough nervousness should President Trump get reelected. There may be enough nervousness about who's going to manage this partnership with the United States, and that may change the dynamics. I think that's a little attempt to make it more sexy. I don't know.
I'm going to regret introducing that word.
I didn't introduce it, by the way. That was something that was told to me by political journalists, so it's already out there in the Japanese vernacular. So don't attribute that to me, but I kind of like the Trump Kaisan as something we can talk about in class, right? So I think there's another piece of this, and a good friend of mine who works for the Yomiuri brought this up at the U.S. Japan Security Conference a week or so ago. And his expression was an expression of anxiety about the post-Abe era. And his anxiety was every time you've had a long-serving Japanese prime minister, Koizumi, for example, in the very recent history of Japanese politics, you have tended to have, this is my word, kind of kaiten sori, annual turnover, that kind of inability to secure a really strong political base in the LDP. And of course, I hadn't thought about that. I thought we were kind of out of that moment of annual transitions in prime ministers. But you could conceive of this may be a moment where Japan does go, not in the forefront of global events with a strong prime minister and a strong base at home, but retreats somewhat into a more, not unstable, because it's very stable, but less defined leadership in that period, and that would be very, very difficult, I think, to manage. The only second thing I'll say is a lot of what Mr. Abe has managed to accomplish is because of the two-thirds majority in the lower house. Now, all kinds of, the LDP-Komeito partnership is a strong and durable one. Both parties it's a symbiotic relationship now in the electoral sense, right? Neither can run opposite each other anymore, right? You can talk to very, very senior LDP Diet members, and they rely on the Komeito vote, even in rural areas. So you're not likely to see a divorce between LDP and Komeito, but you could see different partnerships. You could see coalition government come back to Japan, even in the absence of a strong opposition contender for the LDP. So there's variance here that we should think about, both in terms of leadership transitions being more frequent, but also the coalition dynamics on certain policy issues in particular, making it more difficult to predict decision-making, both domestic and foreign policy. So I don't know how you want us to end here, but I think one piece of the puzzle is the Olympics is going to be a crowning, as Tobias said, I think it's going to be Mr. Abe's crowning moment. God forbid anything should not go well. Olympics are hard. They're hard to manage. In a week or two, the governor of Tokyo will be in town. She too is going to have to manage a very diverse and complicated scenario of managing Olympics. Not every country that hosts the Olympics, not every city has a good experience. We all know that, whether we look at Rio or Los Angeles or, this is a complicated process for Japan and for Tokyo. And so we shouldn't take it as given that this is going to be smooth and without its own bumps along the way. I'm not wishing bumps, but I think we should just make sure that we pay attention where we can to the ways in which the United States and others can help it along the way be more secure and more successful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
The end.
Thank you. The end. No, I appreciate that. No, that's terrific. And you've left us a few things we can dive into even more detail in the Q&A. Now I want to turn to Dai, and I'm so glad that he's here with us today because, and we heard a lot of it in Assistant Secretary Stilwell's remarks as well, this emphasis on innovation, this emphasis on kind of the shared mission or the imperative of alliance cooperation in science and technology, research and development, information security, technology security, and of course the cybersecurity piece is big in that regard, and in the context of making the Olympics go smoothly. Mochinaga-san, let me ask you to give some of your thoughts about the coming year.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a new guy, and I'm a computer scientist. So I talk about a little bit of different aspect of the technology. I'd like to talk about the new challenges in Japan will have in 2020. Especially first, I'd like to talk about why the new technology is difficult to handle in our society. And the next, I'd like to introduce about the new trends in Japan, especially Tokyo 2020 Olympic, and the new policies and new technology such as 5Gs. So I'd like to first talk about the difficulties in new technology. New technology is difficult because of it has a strong connection between our economy, and the other one is the difference of the level of knowledge. The first, our life is highly dependent on the computer system which support our daily life. For example, power generations or power grids or telecommunications. At the same time, we face the cyber threat motivated by financial gain or stealing trade secrets. Therefore, scope of the cybersecurity expanded to the protecting our economy. And the difference, the difficulty in the level of knowledge is, for example, I like to say regarding a cybersecurity, a computer system is vulnerable. Computer system is only be attacked if there is a vulnerability in the system. If the computer is simple or transparent, we guarantee that the system is very safe. However, every day, every year, our computer system is getting more complex, and networks and the networks and the softwares also become complex. Moreover, our society, especially people and organization using the computer is also complex. So the whole system is complex that you will have the vulnerability in your system. And for the attackers, they will exploit that kind of vulnerabilities. Vulnerability you don't know. Why we don't know? Because we don't have enough knowledge about the computers. So there is so much difference in the level of knowledge. That makes technology is difficult for handling in the policies or political issues. So the upcoming trends in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, there are so many new technologies. It will be introduced in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. For example, the monitoring system deployed in the airport or the stadium or stations that monitoring the people's behavior for safety operations. At the same time, Olympic Games are the attractive target for the adversaries for disrupting that games by the cyber attacks. And the cyber attacks can attack not only website but also critical infrastructures that will make power shut down. And recent Olympic Games demonstrate that such a kind of threat, especially the Pyeongchang 2018 Winter Olympic Games. A cyber attack shut down their internet access and trying to shut down website and power outages. So the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Organizing Committee and the Japanese government trying to prevent such a kind of cyber attacks. However, Japan will face the massive amount of cyber attacks. We cannot escape from that. So the Japanese, not only Japanese, but also worldwide cybersecurity experts moving toward to the system, making a system resilient. That means that focus on the recovery as well as prevention. So the new movement towards the resilience is big challenge for Japan and world cybersecurity researchers. Japanese cybersecurity policy is started in 2000, and its initial stage they are focusing on regarding the protecting governmental agencies and the critical infrastructures, but the dramatic change happened in 2014. It is that Abe administration changed the national security policy toward proactive pacifism, and the Japanese government declared to maintain offensive cyber capability. Last new national defense program guideline established in 2018. This is a new era for Japanese defense policy to have the offensive capability in the cyber domain. Japan has already established the cyber defense unit in 2014, and it started with the 19 personnel. But in this year, it will grow to 290 personnel. It's still small, but it grows dramatically. However, they will try to get their offensive capability in this year, in this next 4 years. However, we have the constitutional and operational limits. For constitutional limits, for example, Constitution prohibits invade the secrecy of telecommunications and do not allow have the strike capability. That is a strong cap for the cyber defense unit. And the other operational limit is the lack of a budget. Japan's defense budget is capped by the 1% of the GDP, but the Japanese self-defense forces cyber budget is very small one. So that kind of budget or other resources restriction will be the issues for the cybersecurity unit in the self-defense forces. The other things, New Japan's challenges in the protection of the new technology is new export control policies. Export control policy is very important for protecting new technology, such as quantum computing or cryptographies. This is a very critical technology for protecting our nations, and it takes a long time to research. But the cyber attacks stealing such a kind of result of research. This is a very critical issues for Japan and the United States. So Japan is now trying to catch up that kind of technological advancement and prevent such a kind of leaking from Japan. And Japanese government, Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industry, set up new guidance regarding the protection against for the cryptographic technologies. In Cold War era, Western countries trying to keep their technologies in the Western regions using the COCOM. COCOM is now is transferred to the Wassenaar Arrangement, and the Wassenaar Arrangement regulates is an international regime for export control. But the crucial issues is such a kind of regime it takes a very long time to revise that kind of regimes. So Japan is taking forward to restrict that kind of restrictions, export control measures before the international regime catch up new technologies. But Japan is a very critical issue is investment for the new technologies. United States is almost invest in new technologies about double of dollars invested to the new technology for 15 years. At the same time, China invests 18 times for 15 years. Japan, still same. So the Japan should invest what we need to do. So this is it.
Terrific. No, that's terrific. Thank you. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of export controls because that opens up some other areas that are becoming increasingly important in the U.S. Japan context. Of course, the U.S. is looking at revising some of its export control rules and regulations. We have the whole 5G Huawei blacklist, entity list. Is it on? Is it off? Dynamic going on and how that impacts Japanese companies, and then sharing of research and development among U.S. and Japanese partnerships in these areas. And Japan just recently instituted a new investment control rule that changes, the U.S. has changed how we operate CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and with an eye toward managing Chinese investment primarily in the United States. Japan has taken similar steps, and there are some similarities but some differences. And I thought it was interesting, just last week or so, the Treasury Department issued new rules that essentially created a bit of a whitelist of countries that get easier access or less screening on investment in foreign direct investment in the United States, the UK, Australia, and Canada. Japan would very much like to be on that list, as would Korea and a bunch of other countries, and the U.S. has indicated that it's open to possibly expanding that list. But this issue of technology security, this issue of defense-based cooperation, all these other things become factors in this. And I think this coming year, these are going to be very big themes going forward. So I have a whole little list of additional questions I'd like to get to, and then we'll jump to the audience. But let me start on the political front and go back to that. Because, first of all, I just wanted to ask Tobias a little bit about the title of his book, because Iconoclast, I had to look it up. And it's, well, I'll let you explain it. But I was at first intrigued and was surprised at the choice of that term, but then the way you explained it to me made a lot of sense. So.
Sure, and always appreciate the opportunity to
talk about
my book, talk about the book. So, I had kind of a list of ideas, was going back and forth with the publisher, and the thing that grabbed me about it, because when you look at Abe's career, I mean, on the one hand, he's a third-generation Diet member, both sides of his family. I mean, both his Abe grandfather and, of course, Prime Minister, the late Kishi Nobusuke were Diet members and prominent politicians. But he comes from this tradition, despite coming from a prominent political family. I mean, he sits very uneasily with the Japan that emerged after 1945. And from the moment he arrived at the Diet, he looked at his elders and the kind of compromises his elders made in terms of accepting the Constitution, accepting restrictions on Japan's playing a global role as a great power. And of course, he inherited many of these ideas from grandfather Kishi. but he wanted, and he said it very plainly in 2006 when he became prime minister for the first time. He wanted to break free of the post-war regimes. And I mean, so this is a politician who, despite coming from well within the establishment, has looked at that establishment and decades of that establishment's choices, and he has wanted to move past them and to end those compromises. And he's never really been shy about it. And he's talks about it himself. I mean, if you remember when he gave his speech before the joint session of Congress, I mean, I remember he said he claimed that it was because of his time in America that that his elders looked at him as cheeky Abe, and it was sort of a laugh line in that speech. But I mean that streak is really throughout, and it doesn't mean that he's not a realist or he's not capable of being pragmatic. I mean, and I think 7 years, now in his 7th, 8th year, he's shown that he's perfectly capable of being that. But he would argue, and I think argued from the beginning of his career, that there was no tension between being a pragmatic realist statesman, but also having kind of a clear vision of where the country had to go. And that so I think that really is sort of the thread that pulls through his entire career. And we still see this now as he tries to navigate a pretty complicated international landscape. And I don't want to step on the toes of the afternoon panel, but that kind of Japan stepping forward and looking at an increasingly multipolar order, there being a place for Japan, not just as an ally of the United States, but sort of as a kind of shaper of international order in its own right. That is, I think, the destiny that he's wanted Japan to realize, really, as his entire career as a politician. So that's, that was really the idea.
Great. No, thank you. Because I've always thought of Abe as a real traditionalist, and yet I think in some ways he's such a traditionalist that the post-war order doesn't fit in a way, or that's what he's looking to reshape. And so that gets me to constitutional revision. And maybe, Sheila, you can jump in here a little bit. Where are we going with this? He brings it up every year in his Diet speech. It's kind of on the agenda. Talking heads get up here and say it'll never happen. But
never me, I said it was going to happen.
I forgot about that already. But can you help us understand a little bit what is, whether it happens or doesn't happen, what is kind of, where are the lines of effort converging eventually, and what areas would potentially be revised if and when that happens? What are your thoughts on that?
So can I plug a CFR product?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
So we had lots of questions about this, and the level of understanding about the Constitution outside of Japan, and even inside Japan actually, is pretty superficial. It's attached to Abe, right? It's his idea, right? Or it's about Article 9 alone. And what a lot of people fail to understand is that the Diet conversation on constitutional revision goes back to 1999. And there was a cross-party committee established in the Diet. There are multitudes. There was a 900-page report that was issued. Parties on the left, parties on the right, had all their different ideas about what might be revised, et cetera, right? So zero on in from 2000 to now, you've had episodes in which electoral politics have also engaged this question of constitutional revision. Maybe surprising to those of us who watch Japanese politics from afar, but the DPJ had a draft for a constitutional revision in the mid-2000s. It was seen then as a kind of premise that, yes, we are able to govern, we can have this policy too. On our info guide on CFR.org, we have Japan's constitutional debate. We have a big sort of overview of both the history of the constitutional debate, right, the politics and how they've evolved over time, and we have more parties today that are open to the idea of constitutional revision, maybe not Mr. Abe's variant, right, but a different variant, right? And then where the Japanese people come down on this. And the Japanese people are pretty steady state. Half people go, okay, yeah, we should talk about it. The rest of the people are like, not so much a priority, right? So the Japanese people have always been sort of resistant to the idea that this is something crucial that we must do now. And yet all of us, if we go to Japan, talk to our friends, some of them will say, sure, let's have a conversation about it. But what they want to revise could be completely different, right? Now, the thing I think is interesting about Abe, right, is he reminded the Japanese public, and he did it repeatedly over and over again in the Diet, that this was the premise of the LDP in 1955. When the liberals and Democrats got together, it was one of the foundational pieces of their agreement. I just went back in the early 50s, between 52 and 55, to look at Article 9 and in the self-defense force law that was debated in the Diet in 54. And you've got a whole different range of discussions about, Nakasone was there, right, from the Kaishinto, all different positions about whether Japan should be independent in terms of its military capability, whether it's okay to rely on the United States, whether the Constitution should be thrown out tomorrow, right? So you've got an active debate in the 1950s, and Kishi Nobusuke emerged to be one of those people as well. But the Liberal Democratic Party was actually formed on the premise that the Constitution would be revised. That was the political bargain at the time. So Abe reminded his, Diet members and his party that was one of their foundational commitments, right? And he again repeated the origin story of why should we have a foreign power determine our, foundational governing document. It's time to put a Japanese imprimatur on that document. What I think is interesting, and this is where I think we are now, is that it's less a conversation about revising the Constitution. It's more about amendments. Adding amendments to the Japanese Constitution, not touching the regular document that was passed in 47, but adding amendments on financing education, right, tertiary education, on crisis management by the executive branch of the Diet, which right now can't decide in crisis if the Diet's not in session, right? But there's a whole host of other things out there from different political parties. But you've moved far away from what we used to think of the right-left politics of constitutional revision. Now it's a question about 21st century challenges to Japan. It's more closer to the political conversation on reform than it's ever been in the past.
Yeah. And quickly before I move on, Ishiba's view on the constitutional revision is is a big friction point, right?
Exactly.
That's a big difference.
On Article 9 specifically, and I think Ishiba and others, there are others, not just Ishiba-san, but there are others inside the LDP themselves who would like to rewrite Article 9. They would like to get rid of that ambiguous second paragraph, for those of you who've read Article 9. They want to be much more forthright about Japanese military, to get rid of the ambiguities that Ishiba himself says, is confusing to our adversaries as well as to our friends, right? We need to be clear about our military power, and we need to be clear about how and when we might use it.
Yeah.
Can I just, unless we're going to come back to it, just
no, we may not come back.
Okay, so as long as we're talking about the constitutional revision debate, I mean, Abe in some ways has a problem in that even as I think people are open to the idea in all sorts of ways, because he's been so zealous about it for a while, I think a lot of voters are just don't trust him necessarily, and I think are a little skeptical that why is he so gung-ho about this? Why does this have to get done? Why does this have to be a priority when there's so many other problems that need to be addressed? And in particular now that you have, I think he has also a problem where. And we've seen this with in some of the debate, the national security law debates and collective self-defense, that a lot of times, I think the public also reacts not even so much to the substance of changes, but to the process. And in a lot of ways, Abe has moved Japan to a more textbook Westminster-style democracy, where the prime minister actually can, what the prime minister says goes as long as the majority, he has a parliamentary majority. But there still are, I think, some lingering kind of consensual norms, and the idea that the prime minister can't deviate too far from public opinion or can't push run too roughshod over the opposition. And so I think Abe has kind of found himself in a bind where, at least until last year, the upper house elections last year, he had, after 2016, in theory, he had supermajorities in both houses. But if you push too hard on that, you push too hard, and the idea that you've run roughshod over the opposition means that you have zero chance of getting a referendum through, which of course is the last step in the process. That you need a majority of the public to agree with you, and so I think he's been stuck in this bind where, in theory, the Diet number, he could start the debate tomorrow, but it would mean basically subverting these norms that it actually, and in fact, norms that the LDP itself agreed to when they started that process and created the Constitution Commissions and the Diet, that it would have to be an all-party process. Everyone would have to sort of agree that this proceeds, and so he's been reluctant to do that. And of course, just as a footnote to this, one of my favorite kind of little tidbits from the debate over the last couple of years is that the lower house Constitution Commission sort of did a little study of how to go about this, and particularly in the referendum process. And one of the people they talked to about convening a national referendum is David Cameron, who's probably an expert on what national referendum should do, and he said, don't go to a referendum unless you're sure that 60% of the public is behind you. And it's, I think, pretty hard to find 60% of the public to agree on a particular form of constitutional revision, let alone leaving aside the procedural questions. And so I think, I mean, there's just, I don't see this changing, certainly not before the Olympics, and even heading up into the end of Abe's term, it's really unlikely. And so then it becomes a question: how does that influence who succeeds Abe? And does it mean that you get someone who's maybe seen as more dovish, and so maybe would be more trusted on it, or do you get sort of another person who's zealous about the issue?
Yeah, Mochinaga-san, as a Japanese voter. And
You're in trouble.
And speak for all Japanese voters.
Look at all those cameras.
Well, and as a cyber policy specialist, I'll give you a chance to go that angle if you want to. Are there aspects of the constitutional amendment revision debate that you think about that either maybe in terms of the 21st century or dealing with some of the technologies and issues that have come up there? Maybe there's some things that you think might be worthwhile, or if you have any other views on the constitutional question.
Yeah, actually, my colleagues and my friends in working for the cybersecurity issues, seeing the constitutional issues for the Article 9 and Article 21 of the secrecy of the telecommunications is a very intensive issue for us. For example, Article 9 of the holding the forces is the issue for the cyber defense unit. For example, if the North Korea trying to attack by the missile, before that, the cyber defense unit is trying to attack that kind of a base and stop that kind of firing the missile by cyber attack. It was not use of force. It's just preventing their firing the missile. Is it possible or not? But in history, Japan decided to not have the striking capability. So it is some kind of strike capability. So it's just talking at end. So we cannot talk about that. It's prohibited in the Article 9. Really? Why we can't talk about that? Is our cybersecurity communities. And the other things is for the intelligence operations, for collecting the information from the cyberspace. For example, kind of the collecting information for the internet traffic is prohibited in the Article 9 because the secrecy, it invades secrecy of the telecommunications. However, we can some people, for example, police or the some military forces is doing the intelligence operations by the wireless communications. They can gather that kind of information because it's not wiretapping. It's just collecting something in air. Yeah. So what is different between that? So this is a crucial issue for the cybersecurity researchers for the Constitution. But for the Japanese people, one of the Japanese people, constitutional revision is one of the issues for the Japanese people. There are so much issues for the social security or the aging society. That is kind of issues because there's such a kind of huge budget is going to that social security, and they cannot invest defense budget, doing the other developing new technology, invest to the new technology. It can't because of the huge social security budget.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to move on to a couple other things, and then we'll open it up. We do have some elections in Japan in 2020 in Okinawa. Assembly general elections will happen in the late spring in 2020, and Okinawa and the Futenma relocation as an alliance issue is, some year, if we keep doing this event every year, some year is going to be the year that either there's the momentum breaks toward, all right, let's just finish this job and get this relocation done, and there's kind of a fushime or kind of a noticeable acceleration in that direction, or the project gets more definitively stopped or canceled or adjusted or changed. Instead, in the last several years, we've been more in this a foot in each camp almost, where things are kind of being obstructed and delayed, but it's moving forward and it's not changing. So I don't know if any of our panel have any thoughts about the coming year. I mean, last year we had the referendum relatively soon after we had held this event, and yet here we are. Any thoughts on the Okinawan situation?
I have lots of thoughts on the Okinawa situation, but I would just caution you not to look for acceleration, because I don't think that's the dialogue that we've seen in the 20-odd years since this conversation began with the people of Okinawa. I think it's 1996, 97 is when FTEMA relocation as a part of consolidating U.S. forces out of that heavily populated residential area began. We are in 2020. So here we are. So a slow accretion and the tug and the pull and the 2 steps forward, 4 steps backward, that I think is largely explainable, but not very comfortably explainable by the fact that the majority of people in Okinawa still don't want new bases there. They were, the bases that are there were imposed. The FTEMA relocation would involve accepting a new base, even though it's on an existing base. I think for politically, that is the way even conservatives will privately tell you. Now, Okinawa political preferences, of course, between the LDP and other parties, that's like everywhere else in Japan. There's tugs and pulls between people of all kinds of different opinions on Social Security, on economic development plans and that kind of stuff. But on the basis, I think you've got a pretty consistent viewpoint, no matter when you are polling across the prefecture. So it's always been a story of Tokyo trying to push the government in Okinawa to resist less or to hold out more carrots to make that resistance weaken. And I think that's the way in which Tokyo has approached it, and I don't think there would have been any other way to do it. Whether you like the relocation project or you don't like it, I think that's the game. However, there's something new, and I think it's important that we register it, and that is there is now a conversation about intermediate range forces, missiles, U.S. missiles going into the region. Already the governor of Okinawa said, not here. No, thank you. So as we think forward about lots of the security force posture shifts, new technologies, new ways of thinking about not only Japanese military capabilities and how they're deployed, because now the Southwestern strategy is what the self-defense force priority is, right, is to put more of their bases down south in the Southwestern region. Be prepared that any attempt to make Okinawa the primary location for new capabilities will ignite new opposition, I think, in the prefecture.
Yeah.
So that's my sense of where we
thanks. That's a good segue into another question that I had, which is the question came up with Assistant Secretary Stilwell, but was deftly avoided. But we get a chance to say whatever we think here. I think what's going on right now in the U.S. host nation support, SMA negotiations, special measures agreement negotiations with South Korea is a terrible development of alliance management. And there were just notifications given as per the union agreement to some of the workers on Korean bases that furloughs could be coming because they're currently without an agreement on their host nation support deal. The U.S. is looking for a fundamentally different model. The Trump administration is looking for a fundamentally different model where some U.S.-based costs would be covered by South Korea as opposed to the current SMA agreement is all basically on peninsula related costs. Personally, I think that would open up a terrible can of worms of the other of Korea then having the right to audit and dive into some of our budgets and on domestic issues, and I don't know why we would want that. But from a Japan point of view, I'm curious about the domestic politics or the domestic dynamics of, and we don't know how things are going to come out in the South Korea negotiations, but we know Japan is next in line for this discussion. And I'm wondering if you all think this is going to be one of the topics of conversation, and maybe we can ask Akita-san too later on about this as well. But I see this as a big train heading down the railroad and the track, and I don't know what we're going to do about it.
So, I mean, in general, I think the risks are huge, and we've seen domestic political backlash in South Korea, so you can't rule out the possibility. I guess I guess the tricky thing for me is the calendar. Thinking about the calendar. One is sort of if you have earlier rounds of negotiations. It's going to depend on what sort of leaks you get. That would shape the extent to which it becomes a domestic political issue. The U.S. presidential election's got to be a factor in how Japan approaches these negotiations. Presumably, that it's in this awkward timing where, do you agree to something early, and assume that that Trump is reelected, or do you kind of hope that you're dealing with a different administration by the time a new deal has to actually be implemented? But then you also have the Japanese budget cycle, because it's got to be in the budget for the next fiscal year, which will be done by the end of the year. So you're in. The figuring out the timing of how to actually do this is tricky, and I guess another factor is that Abe's had a lot of leeway when it comes to kind of managing his relationship with Trump, and sort of people have trusted that maybe he's not getting a lot of tangible benefits for Japan. That the U.S. Japan trade agreement was generally skewed towards U.S. interests, but I think people have been pretty forgiving of Abe's handling of that, and so that's got to be a factor as well. That you're not going to necessarily see an immediate backlash. Unless it's so obvious that the U.S. demands are extravagant and Japan can't possibly pay. There's a lot of incentives to try to fudge this and to not let things get out of control. Certainly for the Abe government, but really I think it doesn't seem that either administration would want it to get too out of control. So. It's a lot of cross-cutting. I don't necessarily think it's guaranteed to blow up, but certainly the risk is there.
Yeah. If there are no other comments on the main panel, I want to make sure we have time for the audience to get their questions in. So I welcome you to raise your hand. I'll follow Jim's request that you identify yourself and keep it as much of a relatively short question as possible. Let's work our way from the back, and then we'll come up to the front here. So I have one hand over there in the far left, and then another gentleman here. So we'll start there, and then here, and then we'll come up to the front.
Hello, I'm Kyung-gu Lee, and I'm a student from South Korea studying here. And thank you all for having this wonderful explanation about Japanese politics and also some of your forecasts. And I have to ask some questions about the future of future Prime Minister of Japan to Dr. Sheila Smith. Some people think that maybe people like Suga or like people like Kishida or Kono might be the next Prime Minister, but some people, at least some people in Korea, think that maybe Abe was too mastermind of maintaining the balance between different factions in LDP, and he was maybe a too mastermind of dealing with domestic policy initiative that there might not be a sufficient alternative, at least until like 2021, that he might try to extend this term as he did in 2018 and maybe becoming Prime Minister again. Do you think there's a possibility that that thing could happen again in the upcoming years?
Sure, I think it's a pretty straightforward answer to that question. That's what the Trump-Kaisan idea is all about. I think the scenario that people are speculating about is that our election could produce a re-election of the president, in which case Mr. Abe is best prepared to deal with that, especially as host nation support. I am less sanguine, I think, than Tobias about HNS. I think the negotiations are going to be bloody. I don't think that we have any other reason to think they won't be. And I think there could be that element to it as well. But here's the thing, the party has already extended his time in office once. He himself has publicly said he's tired. He doesn't have an appetite for a fourth term. Any politician that says they don't want to have an appetite for the next term usually can be persuaded, right? So it won't be Mr. Abe going to the party and saying, give me another term. It will be the party going to Mr. Abe saying, we can't do it without you, right? So that's the scenario. What will condition that scenario? Again, we've got lots of speculative answers to that. Mr. Nikai, who's the Secretary General of the party, has already said that could be done, that the party could rewrite the rules if it was necessary. So I think my third from all that basket of potential successors, right? The second basket being Mr. Ishida, and then the third basket is the Trump-Kaisan, which is the Abe option, right? Can't tell you with any probability how high that probability is, though.
I mean, I would also add, too, that I don't know if I take Abe's protestations that seriously, because it's hard to imagine him out of politics. I mean, he is such...
Well, he was out for a while.
Yeah, but he was itching to get back into the arena, within weeks after that, and that, and I think he was. In some ways, you read kind of his recollections of the time after his resignation, that he almost was withering, that he needed to be in the arena, and that he needed to keep fighting, and in some ways, as long as constitutional revision's done, it's almost hard to see him wanting to say, okay, I give up. I didn't achieve my one great goal of political life. And so, I mean, there's certainly, I think it's easy, I agree, it's, the link to our election, I think, is hard to avoid, which would mean that I think so around March of next year, when the LDP has its convention, that would be, really the thing to watch, so between November and March of next year, is there sort of a groundswell of support for that?
Thank you. I had another question there, gentleman there, and then we'll work our way around.
シラ先生、明けましておめでとうございます。I'm Kenny from Okinawa Prefecture Government, Washington, D.C. office. Yes, my question is today is a little bit about more specifically about the Henoko new base construction project. Because it was already 20 years ago, and just recently, Japanese government officially admit that it will take another 12 years. We all are aware that the growing rapid threat of China power and necessity of the confront all these coming capability. So my question is that, how do you feel about this 12 years time span when it comes to the strategic changes in the U.S. Marine and Navy reconstruction in the region? Thank you.
Anybody want to jump on that?
So I have been watching this since I was in the prefecture in 1998. I've been watching it, but I'm watching it today from a distance. And so I have less of a sense of the internal, inside the prefecture thinking. It doesn't surprise me that we are not on the cusp of immediate resolution or an acceleration of completion of the project. It doesn't. But in the years when I have gone back to visit Okinawa, I have gone up to see Camp Schwab and to Henoko, and there's been considerable transformation, right? In terms of how much concrete is there and how much what was a very quiet Ouroang is now a pretty foundational construction has been done for the new base. So the question is it ever going to happen? And if so, whose base is that going to be? And our Marine Corps, of course, now works extensively with the ground self-defense forces. They work in the amphibious battalion development. They work in Saga, and they work in other parts of Kyushu to support and enhance capabilities of the ground self-defense force, first and foremost, but all three self-defense forces. They also work off-site. They work in all different parts of Japan, but also they work off of Japan as well. The Guam base is another piece. Jim is the expert on that more than I, but this dispersal idea that was part of the Obama administration, and it continues to be some of the ways in which our military envisions its operations across the region, has also had an impact on the importance of that base, right, to our Marine Corps. It's very important. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not the one crucial piece of the puzzle the way it used to be back in the 1990s. On the China, I think the important thing to watch here is Japan's own defense strategy and the way in which the self-defense forces now are relocating to Sakijima in Okinawa, which are the islands, not the main island where the bases exist already, but the islands, Yonaguni, Miyako, Ishigaki, and then up into the islands further north outside the prefecture. That's where the Japanese military is investing. That's where I think you're going to see the most transformation in terms of military forces in the next 10 to 12 years. And they're not going to be U.S. forces. They're going to be Japanese.
Thank you. And for what it's worth, I'll throw my quick view in there, which I know is not popular in Okinawa. But if I were running for governor in Okinawa, I would be making the pitch that my goal is to get this completed as quickly as possible, and I'm going to become a partner in this process so that we can get Futenma closed and we can get a more safe operating posture up there, reduce forces, U.S. forces, and then I want to have on the table the next step of burden reduction, or what's the next step of kind of relieving the burden on Okinawa, because I feel like we're just stuck in this position and nothing is changing. So I don't see Henoko as the end of this process, but I think we have to make that move in order to get to the next step. But it is a difficult issue for sure. Let's move up to the front. I'm going to take these two questions together here. I have two hands here. We'll take these two one after another, and then we'll
Thank you very much. My name is Dong-Yeon Kim from Voice of America Korean Service. Now, if you go back to what Prime Minister Abe had published in his book, Nihon no Getsuei, the Japanese resolution, he underlines one of the priority, and one of the things was the resolve of the North Korean abductee issue. And as the Tokyo Olympic is coming out, and we saw the Pyeongchang Olympic as being some kind of a momentum for the North Korean relationship, and we know that Prime Minister Abe has been really pushing forward to have some direct conversation with North Korea, which has been a failure. Now, North Korea, being with his harsh rhetoric this year, there is a speculation of having a ballistic missile fire or something. How do you see the calculation regarding with that of the Tokyo Olympic and his agenda of having a normalization with North Korea, and how North Korea would react toward the Tokyo Olympic?
Okay, thanks, and we will get to some of that in the afternoon, but you can touch on that, and then let's get another question.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. This is a huge question, but just in general, what is the public opinion, and are there any political differences with respect to climate change, decarbonization, and what's the status of nuclear power?
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll take a stab at that. That might. Let me turn to the panel here. How about on the first one, just North Korea?
Okay.
You go first.
Okay. Okay. I'd like to take about the North Korea issue and Tokyo Olympics Games. I think two issues is not directly connect. This is my answer, because the Prime Minister Abe thinking of success of Tokyo 2020 Olympic is in this year's highlight. So the North Korea issues take more time. So don't rush such a kind of issue, and take time to resolve the North Korea issues, even if the Japanese people in North Korea and the other type of issues, nuclear issues, something like that. But the Tokyo 2020 Olympic is almost 6 months. 6 months. There is 6 months, so it's too short to resolve the other kind of issue connected with that kind of issues. Okay.
And to some extent, the Olympics also connects to this broader climate change discussion in the context of, certainly Japan is positioning these games as environmentally friendly aspect. I know they were pushing today. I heard on the radio news featuring hydrogen as a part of the fuel for the torch and for other types of things to reduce emissions. Now there's a PR aspect and a public diplomacy aspect to this theme. Does anybody have any thoughts on kind of the more underlying substance in this this climate change. Not necessarily our area of expertise, but.
I mean, I think if we want to talk about Abe's legacy, I mean, I think climate change is probably one of the weakest parts of it. That he said the right things, and he's not in the world of sort of climate change villains. There are countries that have. We're not exactly in a position to criticize him on that, but it's more a question of what he could have done. That here's a leader who's been the strongest leader his country has seen in decades. Stable politics. At least a kind of historical reputation of being good on kind of green issues and climate issues. And while he said the right things, why hasn't there been a Japanese Green New Deal, for example? He's talked about technological innovation and the private sector can do its job, but why hasn't his government been really at the lead of that? And he talked a big game about getting nuclear power back going early on in his tenure. And he hasn't really been willing to take risks to make it happen. The restarts have been really slow. They've gotten some back online, and then they've had to go back offline. There's been a lot of domestic opposition. There's been a lot of legal opposition. It's just not, it's not where he said and where Mehdi thought it would be as part of Japan's energy mix. And so instead, like we've seen in places like Germany, you have coal and other fossil fuels are making up for that lost generation. And so it's not. So Japan's not the worst out there, obviously. Its Paris goals were less than ambitious, you would say, and certainly depending on the benchmark you use, they could have been more robust. And so it's more about missed opportunities. Could Abe have been a different kind of leader? And he's hinted at trying to do that in the last couple of years, but there hasn't really been the investment in really sustained political capital. There's been a lot of we can kind of innovate our way out of this, but I don't. I don't think that's enough. And I think saying that we have companies that can do the job. I don't think anyone thinks that's adequate to the kind of the challenge that not just Japan. I mean, Japan obviously is seeing the effects already. Look at the heat waves the last couple of years and more powerful storms. I mean, Japan is not immune from this by any means. But globally, Japan could have been, I think, a different kind of leader on this issue, and I don't think that's happened.
Can I just
Sure.
one thing on that? I think we shouldn't underestimate the domestic political complications that emerged after 3/11.
Yeah.
And so you've got, just before 3/11, Fukushima happened, you've got an energy policy put forward by the DPJ, but echoed by a previous policy by the LDP. So there's consensus on both sides on this, right? That you'd have 40% self-sufficiency in energy, and that was going to be nuclear. And so you don't have what you see in Germany, which is the German public turning completely against nuclear energy. You don't have fully that you don't have that kind of public response, but you do have the complex regulatory piece of local government, national government oversight. The oversight is still not trusted completely, despite the institutional revisions. And then you've got this question of, well, what else is there for Japan? And that dependence on overseas sources of energy is real. And I think you could talk to the Japanese corporations that despite innovative technologies and investments in renewables, it's never going to be as much as the aspiration, which was the 40%, right, a decade ago. So the politics are more complicated at home, but the needs of Japan are greater in some ways in terms of sourcing and diversifying sourcing of energy. And I think that domestic piece is going to be an Achilles heel for Japan going forward. Makes it hard for Japan to lead on climate change. Yeah. You just saw Mr. Koizumi, the environmental minister at the United Nations, almost getting booed off the stage. And that comes from a country that led at the Kyoto meeting. So, this is where domestic politics can really confound some of the larger ambitions of Japan to lead in some of these areas globally.
Yeah, it is really mixed because there is the coal piece, as you mentioned, or refer to, but Japan has also really been investing a lot in the region in the natural gas, right. LNG infrastructure right. that will make a difference in the overall emissions from that region over time. So, so a mixed story. I'm going to take 2 more questions from the back. Boom, those 2 hands there. Let's do those 2.
My name is David Loudon, and thank you so much for hosting this event today. My question is for Mochinaga-san. If not sufficiently addressed at present, I would ask, has anyone brought forth the idea of a digital network environment threat response policy. And that might indeed take an amendment that Dr. Smith had outlined to accommodate. But the intent of that is not offensive, it's to neutralize the threat. And with such, with the immediacy, if we're considering the Olympics and other events that are going to happen later on this year, this might be the perfect forum to raise that issue, especially if we have any Japanese politicians or members of their state here. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you get that? Did you? Okay.
Hi, Manny Manriquez, Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association. Great to see you all. Another technology question for you. So I think there is rising awareness and concern in the U.S. tech community that some of the United States efforts, some of the current administration's efforts really, to pressure Huawei and pressure China on technology competition is creating greater sort of vertical integration of companies like Huawei, therefore sort of hastening the creation of two parallel competing systems. I'm wondering, what's the conversation like in Japan on this? Do they have the same concerns? What do you think the Japanese approach will be to this challenge?
Okay, thank you for your questions. First, I'd like to talk about how can Japan make a countermeasure for prohibiting the offensive capabilities. One solution is making a more resilient system in Japan. For example, if we take down some kind of power outage, how can we first fix that kind of issues, and how can we cover that power stations, and that kind of capability can be used as a countermeasures, not being an offense of the other issues. And for offensive issues is cannot be separate from the defense issues in cyber domain, because the cyber is not in cyber domain. Only defense cannot be defense our system. So we have to learn about offensive tools. We have to learn about offensive measures, and how can they think about offense? How can we attack us? It's the same as thinking about how can defense our side. So we cannot totally forget about the offensive things. So, but we have to keep in mind in offensive things, but focusing on defense and resiliency. And the next thing is Huawei and parallel situation, parallel internet discussion in Japan is Japan hold their free open Indo-Pacific vision, free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and they the Abe administration is set that kind of vision as a set of principle as a rule of law or openness and that kind of principle can be applied to the internet issues, because if the China or Huawei or that kind of companies, if they are open and they follow the rule of law, we welcome the Huawei, because they share our vision. But the Japanese researchers of their internet thinking Huawei does not agree with that kind of principle. That is a very, very critical issue for the Huawei issues. And on the Russia is approved a new law about the cutting from the internet and in the Russian networks. That kind of movement is going toward to cut off the authoritarian network system in the Eurasian nation. That's how, for example, China now promoting the digital Silk Road in the East Asian countries, and they introduce Huawei equipment, and next they will introduce a Chinese legislation in the cyber domain. For example, protecting data, protecting privacy, and how to control the traffic of the data. And they should controlling the data in their country, or they on having countries who has own view about the authoritarian mechanisms. So that kind of issue is going to be making things difficult.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your questions. And I'm sure we'll get to some of the technology and trade issues as well in the afternoon panel. My quick final prediction question: Will I be able to gamble at a casino in Japan before the end of the year? No.
No. No.
How about?
And certainly not with a cabinet member.
Okay. All right. So sorry, we didn't get to casinos, but we'll leave a few issues for next year to discuss. Thank you, panel. Terrific start. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. We are
Well
going
done.
to take a break for lunch. We have sandwiches and salad and things. We're going to start the keynote speech session at 1 o'clock. So you have a half hour for lunch. Thank you.